Hi everyone. Well, how are you enjoying the personality development chapter? I think it's really fascinating to see how we can all be so similar and yet be so different. Part of it's genetics, part of it's our environment, and I don't know what else it can be. The way we're conditioned, but that's of course environment. Well, that chapter had a lot of Freud in it, and it may have freaked some of you out, but please remember that all the stuff he's talking about with Oedipus and Electra, this is all unconscious. We're totally aware of it. And of course, it's not provable. It's his theory, and that's the fun of theories. And I've also mentioned that Freud in psychoanalysis is the most well-known term when it comes to psychology in the entire world. You may have noticed the other day that I wore my Pink Freud t-shirt that my husband gave me. Well, there's lots of Freud memorabilia out there, but I have a special guest for you today. I have Dr. Freud. Y'all, I have come to see you all the way from Austria and London. That's right, I have a Freud finger puppet. And not only do I have a Freud finger puppet, but his friend, Dr. Jung. Yeah, the archetypes are heavy with this one. And over here we have a little Napoleon, and we have Freud's sofa. So yeah, Dr. Freud can sit back up, oops, that's Carl, can sit back up here in his chair at the head and take notes while Napoleon talks about how wonderful and grand he is. And of course I have my Pink Freud coffee cup. Cheers, everyone. And so you can see them without me putting my feet on the desk, here are my Pink Freud's, or my Freud slippers. All of this, I also have Anna Freud, Freud's daughter, who became a well-known and well-respected child psychologist and did not agree with her father either. So anyway, I just brought the fun things today because, well, I need some fun in my life too. I have a Freud action figure, but he's somewhere down in the basement and I'm not sure where he is, so you're missing out on seeing him today. Okay, well, this is our last lecture for Unit 3 on personality development. Our exam is on April the 9th. I will be hooked up to my email during the regular exam times, whether your class is at 8 to 9:15 or whether your class is 11 to 12:15. So I will be available to you during those times to get right back to you. I'll check my emails during the day, all right? You will do a document with your answers on it, like 1 is A, 2 is B, 3 is C, whatever, and you will email those to me. It's unlike the if you've taken online classes, how you normally take the test online. This way we're connecting through email. But the day before, on April the 8th, I will send you a complete email with all of the instructions. You'll have a chance to answer, ask me questions, and I'll get back to you with the answers in regard to the test. It's all multiple choice this time. There's no essay to write on it, so it should be a fairly easy go for you, I think. So be sure and check your emails on April the 8th and give all of the sites a try. I saw a cartoon on Facebook the other day. I'm not cleaning the house the way everybody else is saying we should do. I'm just, hanging out. And it was a little bit Freudian. I think it was a duck or something, and there was a little duck angel over here and a little duck devil over here. Basically, super ego and id. And the super ego angel is saying, eat healthy, fruits and vegetables, exercise. And the little devil duck over here, id, is saying, eat all of the snacks now. You have sweatpants to wear. And I just thought it was funny. I wished I had a way to bring it to you instead of just telling you about it. All right, let's get right into our material. Last lecture on this unit, and I'll see you on test day. Bye now. Hi, everybody. Well, we're back again, and this is the third of the programs that I'm putting up on YouTube for you. We're just going to take this chance at the end here to take a look at one more slide on Freud and his view of women before we change to a different boat, so to speak. We had been talking about Freud in terms of the testability of his work and the inadequacy of evidence that he left for us, and that it was just very difficult proved. But Freud had some other attitudes that were less than modern, we might say, and one of those was sexism. Freud really thought that women were less than, that we were deviant from others. And this was in part because he used men as the standard behavior, and quite honestly, men and women are just different in many ways. And Freud pointed some of those differences out as far as he was concerned, that we were more vain and masochistic, meaning we would harm ourselves more. We were jealous, we were more emotional, we were less ethical, we were less moral, which I find interesting because if you look at criminality and who commits crimes, considering that they're probably less ethical and less moral, it's men who commit the crimes. But Horney and other female psychologists tried to set him straight and pointed out to him that we're not deviant, we're different, and that women have their own expertise and their own style. But it was really interesting. Women had to be, if you went on a date, you had to have somebody to watch over you because, let's face it, we're more easily seduced. So you had to have that person that went with you, that grandma or somebody that went. Freud had a lot of kids, though. He had a daughter, Anna Freud. She became a child psychologist. She talked a lot about ego and how we are trained to fit in society. So he probably didn't like that so much because he liked all those secret and buried drivers that cause us to do what we do. All right, we're going to move on now. You know that I love Carl Rogers. I've pointed that out before. I even had a slide in the early days of this class where I had little hearts with Carl Rogers' face. And he had what's called a humanistic perspective on personality. And we looked at that early on in Chapter 1. We said that he was the third force, or humanistic perspective on personality was the third force. We had Freud as the first, we had behaviorism for 50 years, and then we had humanistic theory of personality development. And it was the breath of fresh air in psychology. It was a third force in psychology. And most importantly, it dealt with how we perceive ourselves, consciously how we would rate ourselves. If we were going to sit down and write out a list of how we think we are and how we would like to be instead, Rogers could take a look at that list and give us some ideas about ourselves. Along with Rogers, Abraham Maslow worked along with humanistic perspective of personality. He's the one that gave us that pyramid with the self-actualization at the top and food, shelter, clothing at the bottom, the physiological needs that we have to have for survival. Remember when we talked about this before, I talked about the importance of this pyramid that Maslow came up with, how popular it was during the civil rights era, because people said, hey, I haven't achieved all that I'm able to do because I haven't been able to have all of these other things. I haven't been allowed to go to school where I want to go to. I haven't had the same kind of regard from the law. I haven't had the same protection from society. So that was very popular at that time. If we look at this subjective perception of ourselves, we can see that he's going to think that something keeps us from being the people that we have the ability to be. Now, we have free will, we have self-awareness, we have innate goodness, according to Rogers, and I agree with him. And he focused on the healthy side of personality. In fact, he called his patients clients. He didn't call them patients. They weren't ill. Let's just see what that means in real speech. On slide 22, you'll see that there's a lot of type on here, and some of it I'll kind of have to explain as we go along with it. He wrote this book on becoming a person. And he says that people should be allowed to actively and voluntarily participate in their therapy. This is entirely different than behaviorism. This is entirely different from psychoanalysis, where we just talk and talk and talk, and the analyst would, analyze our responses and tell us what was wrong with us. We were clients, and we got to make suggestions, and we got to participate in our therapy if we went to see him. You see on your slide there that he was influenced by Horney when it talks about the motivation for actualizing tendency. This is kind of weird if you think about it. Horney was psychoanalytical. She came down as one of the new Freudians, and yet she had a lot of influence on Carl Rogers. So talk about this down here. Self-concept, perception and belief about yourself. The need for positive regard. There's two kinds of positive regard you'll see here, A and B. A, conditional positive regard, which makes incongruence in your life. Conditional positive regard is where if you say and do and think and are the way I want you to be, then I love you. Then you're a good person. Then you have value to me. But when you don't do those things, when you go against what I want you to do, what I think you should do, suddenly you don't have much merit in my eyes. And think about it. When you make good grades on an exam, you probably hear, I'm really proud of you. I'm really proud of you for doing well in school. I'm really glad your GPA is good and all of those kinds of things. But what happens if you make a really crappy grade on an exam? Or make a crappy grade on a whole semester? Do you get scolded? Do you get sulked about? Do you get, well, that $100 I was going to give you when you finish the semester, you're sure not getting that. When you don't meet someone else's expectations, suddenly they are disapproving and judgmental of you. Now, Rogers is going to say we need unconditional positive regard. And this is tricky. Let's take the grades, the good grades. Is the person proud of you because you got good grades, or are they proud of your good grades because it makes them look good because they're a parent? Don't go home and tell them I said that, okay? I'll get in trouble with your parents. But really, you are the same person whether or not you make good grades or bad grades. You are the exact same person. You have the same personality, you have the same morals, you have the same ethics, you have the same introversion or extraversion. Your value does not change because the behavior that you had meets their expectation, and maybe yours, or doesn't meet that expectation. And when people treat you as though you are less now that you didn't meet their expectations, especially in childhood, this sets up a real barrier to us creating that world that we want. This third thing down here on C is important. He did not advocate permissive parenting, but what you need to focus on is the behavior, not the person. Let's say you work for a boss. And I've used this example before, and the boss says, are you so lazy and stupid that you can't set your alarm clock and get to work on time? Okay, so you're lazy and you're stupid and you're incapable of getting to work on time. Or is it a case of, Charlie, we really like you working here, but your tardiness is not something that we can continue to allow. If this pattern of behavior keeps up, I'm afraid I'm going to have to put you on suspension and you may possibly lose your job. See, there, Charlie's still a good employee. He just has some bad behaviors. In the first example, Charlie was, he wasn't for crap, okay? He just didn't matter. So in talking to other people, your partners, your friends, your spouse, your children, this takes some work. If you're going to be critical of something that they do, you have to realize that it's so much better to address the behavior than it is to be insulting and snotty to the person themselves. That's just not a good practice. So on slide 23 here, we have a couple of Venn diagrams. The first one shows incongruence, and the second one shows congruence. And congruence is what we want to work toward. Look at what it says at the bottom. The self-image is different to the ideal self. There's only a little bit of overlap. In this case, self-actualization would be very, very difficult. Well, let's look at this. Self-image. So if you were to write down on that list of what am I like, and you wrote, I'm afraid of life, and I'm always screwing up, and everybody thinks I'm kind of a loser. Here I am 40 and I'm still working at Walmart for minimum wage. Gosh, or I've got a job that means that I manipulate and lie to people, and I want to be loving and kind and everything, but my spouse is a bully, so I can't be loving and thoughtful. So you've got all these negative images of how you are. And if you say, well, how would you like to be? If you could wave a magic and be who you want to be, what would it be like? You say, well, gosh, I'd be confident and competent and I'd make good decisions and I'd be successful here at Walmart, or I love being honest and moral and ethical and loving and thoughtful. That's the person I really am on the inside. That's what I want to be. Gosh, there's a whole lot of difference from list 1 and list 2, isn't there? And there's probably very little overlap between who we think we are and who we want to be. In the second
Venn drawing, the congruent Venn drawing, the self is similar to the ideal self. I'm not always confident. Sometimes I'm a little bit nervous about something. I'm not always successful about stuff, but I think I will get a raise this fall. I think I'm moral and ethical. I wouldn't steal from anybody. Maybe I fudged on my taxes a little bit. So see, there's a lot more overlap there. And when we have that overlap between what we think we are or who we think we are and who we want to be, then we have the ability to self-actualize. Then we have the ability to grow and be and feel good about ourselves. While Freud gave us this concept that childhood was incredibly important, Rogers gives us a new look at how childhood is important and how children should be treated. And adults as well, by the way. Slide 24, evaluating humanistic perspective. Of course, everybody gets criticized when we look at them. The critics are always the ones who write the reviews. But there were some criticisms of humanistic perspective, even though I like it a lot. It was criticized basically on two counts. One thing, it's observational and philosophical. There's no research here. There's no experiments here. It's looking at people and how they've grown up and how they turn out and whether they're happy or whether they're unhappy, how they interact with other people. Basically, it's just observational. And it's too optimistic, according to the critics. Most people don't self-actualize as far as they could be. I don't know what I could have been. Maybe I could have been a famous doctor or just a doctor. I would consider that to be above my pay grade. Perhaps I should have done more volunteer work and been a source of mercy and kindness in the world. I don't know. I'm happy where I am. And most of us reach a place that isn't as high as we could go in self-actualization, but is where we're comfortable, where we like our lives. And it's like, oh, I think I'll stay here. I don't think I'll go get another degree. I don't think I'll go try to start another company. I like where I am. So perhaps it was a little too optimistic in us self-actualizing completely. Now, the influence of humanistic psychology has kind of waned since the 60s and the 70s. I still have my Carl Rogers books that I read. They made such a difference in my life. But it really did make a lasting contribution to psychotherapy. Talk therapy basically came from Carl Rogers. He was the man who asked the open-ended questions and let you talk, and then he asked you other questions. He created a kind of therapy that let us set out markers for the client to follow and come to their own wisdom. And it was very powerful in psychology. It wasn't him and his followers telling us what was wrong with us. It was them trying to see how we were mentally healthy and how we could increase that. So I really like Rogers, and I particularly like his belief that we have freedom of will, that we have freedom of thought, we have freedom to change over the lifetime. We never stop growing. We always get to be better than we were if we want to. Now, on slide 25, you see the social cognitive perspective of personality. You know what social is. Social is going to be all of that conditioning, learning through reward and punishment. And cognitive has to do with thinking, right? That's the process of thinking. So social cognitive perspective of personality is, in my book, a little bit shallow. And the person I always think of when social cognitive comes into play is Dr. Phil. Now, I'm not a big fan of Dr. Phil, but Dr. Phil is kind of famous for saying, well, how's that working for you? And then when you say, well, it's not working for me, he wants to know why you're still doing it if it's not working. So it is an awareness of what is going on today. It doesn't really touch on why things happen. There are experimental findings about what people do under certain situations, but why they do it really doesn't come into play. It does emphasize conscious thinking and self-regulating behavior, and that means if you screw up, it's your fault. You chose to do it. You should have thought it through, and if you didn't, you still made the choice. So the emphasis is on you. This sense of self depends on your thoughts and your feelings and your behaviors in any given situation. So they can give you a situation and ask you what you would do in that situation. They could even set up a scenario where a situation comes into play and they watch and see what you do. So there is a lot of material and research on social cognitive perspective. It just doesn't give you the reason why. There's just no background for how personality really came to be other than, well, you were conditioned and you've got a mind to think about things. We both know now that conditioning is very powerful, and sometimes we just don't know why we do the things we do. On our next slide here, and we're still on this thing of social cognitive, we have the name Albert Bandura. And you've heard this name before in class. This is a guy that had the Bobo doll experiments, where the kids saw the different videos of kids getting rewarded or punished or ignored for beating up the Bobo doll. So he's the observational learning guy. And he also believed in something called self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is our belief in ourselves to be able to accomplish something. He's going to look at this through his eyes and say, well, what did society teach you about this? And what do you think about this? And how does it regulate what you do? And he says we observe the consequences. And this is operant conditioning, plain and simple. We have been there time and time again. And he says that there's this thing called reciprocal determinism. And I like reciprocal determinism. It doesn't always explain why, but it's one theory that's out there. So you've got your behaviors, what I think about something. And you have your situation that's there, and you have the behaviors that you've seen before and the behaviors that you've tried to do before. So you can have a behavior, you can think about that, and you can see if the situation is fit for it. It's three ways: what I think, what I do, and what society says about it. And I've pointed out to you before, it really wouldn't matter how many films I watched on playing golf. I'm just not going to have game. I could watch those golf videos all day long. I could go take private golf lessons again. I have a bad back. I am never going to be a decent golfer. So when I think about now, should I maybe, take my clubs and go over to the golf course nearby and hit a bucket of balls? Nah, probably not. What's the point in it? I self-determine that I'm not going to do it based off of what I think and my experience in the past, and that controls my behavior now. So this is, Bandura, as I said, is still part of this social cognitive theory. So on slide 27, we have that term self-efficacy again. The beliefs of self-efficacy. Do you believe in yourself? How much do you believe in yourself? How do you gain those experiences in life that let you have what they call mastery experiences that help you grow? This also goes back to Erikson when we think about elementary school and how children learn that they're capable and that they fit in and that they can try new things and succeed with it. He does say that this all begins in childhood, but I think it affects what we're doing now. Are there some of you that don't think you'll really ever finish your college degree because there's something in you that isn't capable of it? I hope that's not true. Even for those of you who haven't done as well as either one of us would like perhaps on exams, does not mean that you don't have a great set of skills and the capacity to learn. I don't think I've had anybody in the last 3 or 4 years that I didn't think could make it through college. But that doesn't matter if you don't think you can do it. It's what you think you can achieve and how you believe in yourself that makes the difference. That's the cognitive side of this argument of, yes, there's society, but there's what you think as well, and that's going to result in how you behave. If we look at the social cognitive perspective and we look at the strengths and the weaknesses of it, well, one of the strengths is there's a lot of research out there. There's observational research, there's situational research, there's just all kinds of psychological testing about these things. It's not just relying on somebody's opinion, on a clinical impression. I don't know if that's better or not. I think it's still very hard to measure. Even if I give you a scenario and say, and what would you do in this situation? That doesn't really prove that you would do it. The criticisms of it are pretty lengthy. First of all, that is a very limited view of personality. It doesn't really give us any idea of what caused your personality be like it is. The development of your personality isn't as important in this field of study as who you are today is. the learning situations that caused you to believe about yourself, what you believe about yourself, they don't know what those are. You might say, well, I think this happened in my childhood or that happened in my childhood. But how accurate is that? We know memory is false. We know perceptions are different. So it's kind of weak in that area as well. Plus, it just ignores any unconscious influences, emotions, or conflicts that we've had. It doesn't pay any attention to what life was like in your childhood. How were you rewarded? How were you punished? Did your parents love each other? Did they yell at you? Were you responsible for being an adult at 9? Or were they wanting to keep you a little kid when you were 12 and they treated you like you were 5? We don't have any emphasis on that whatsoever. And it places a responsibility squarely on your shoulders. If you screw up, it's your fault. Now, it's nice when you succeed and that's your fault, but I think that can tear people down. I got fired, it must be my fault. Oh, I ended up divorced, it must be my fault. Oh, well, this happened, that happened, it must be my fault because I screwed up. I think there's real drawbacks to this, to tell you the truth. It doesn't seem to take much else into consideration. Trait perspective on personality. And hopefully you all did your PF-16s or your Myers-Briggs and played around with the trait theory a little bit. I know people seem to have fun with it. Trait theory, again, is one of those things that kind of describes how we are without a whole lot of looking at how we got to how we are. It's describing and measuring the differences between people rather than trying to jam us all into the same box, which I like that. I like that idea. The concept is that these traits are going to be fairly dependable. It says enduring predisposition means forever you're pretty much going to be the same way to behave in a certain way. So if you're an introvert, you're probably always going to be an introvert. If you're neurotic, you might always be neurotic. If you're a person who loves, fun and new experiences, you're probably always going to be a person that likes fun and new experiences. That's what enduring predisposition would mean. So these things are typically on a range and we've looked at ranges before, from one extreme to the other, and we all probably fall kind of someplace in the middle on these characteristics. And some characteristics are very observable in people. Others are much more hidden. So we call the ones that are easily seen surface characteristics, and we call the ones that are not so easily seen, that are the basic foundation characteristics, we call those source traits. On page 426 of your textbook, you're going to see a diagram that shows the source traits and the surface traits that come from that. So you see that there's only a few source traits and the rest are surface traits. So we see passiveness, carefulness, thoughtfulness, controlledness, calmness, all attributed to people that are introverts. But don't you think that extroverts can be thoughtful? Don't you think extroverts could be controlled and careful? Maybe in a different way? Most of us are somewhere in the middle. I wonder about these things sometimes. When you take something like introversion and extroversion, on one hand, I know how to go out and public speak in front of 500 people and probably be less terrified than you are if you have to give a report in front of a class. Because I've done it so many times, I've had so many mastery experiences with it that it doesn't shake me up anymore. You take me to a party with a lot of people in it, and I don't know those people, you're going to find me off in the bathroom reading a book. You put me in a group where I know the people, and suddenly I can be the life of the party. So I think of myself as an introvert, but I know how to behave as an extrovert out in the world, but left to my own devices, I'm pretty much an introvert. I draw my energy from being with my own thoughts, living in my own head, rather than by going out and needing to be with a lot of people like an extrovert would be. But I know how to do both. I just know who I am. Now, let's say I'm at that party with a lot of people and I don't know those people and I want to go hide out for a while. I wonder if that is my fear of being judged. I wonder if that's really insecurity rather than just liking to be by myself more. Because when I'm with a group of people that I know, I don't have any urge to go and hide. So it's not always as easy to just see these traits and think we know what they mean as what it is. These surface traits, okay, you could come to my house and you could see that I really like to read. There's books and magazines everywhere. What source trait does that come from? So as we turn over to the next slide, Raymond Cattell and Hans Eysenck, these are some of the first researchers on this trait theory. Cattell, he used these statistical techniques, this factor analysis, meaning he could feed everything into the computer and have it programmed so it gave him results. And he set it up so that all these questions he would ask you would feed into 16 key personality types. He could have 500 questions, but it would really sort out to being questions, though they were mixed up, would feed back in and point out these 16 personality factors. And I said to you, you could use the PF, the 16 PF if you wanted to, and it's popular. It's the basis for a lot of personality profiles out there today. But 16 key personality traits, that's a whole lot of traits. So Hans Eysenck, who was a British dude, says, no, that's wrong. There's only 3 basic dimensions of personality that are those source traits, and everything else is a surface trait. And the first one he said, and we look at a range again, is introversion through extraversion. He said that high introverts are quiet, solitary, reserved, and they avoid new experiences. But if you're an extrovert, you get to be outgoing and sociable and love new experiences and love a stimulating environment. Okay, where do you fall somewhere in the middle of that scale? I fall, when left to myself, on the introverted side of it. But in my work, I've always had to fall on the extroverted side of it. And even though I'm an introvert, I love to travel and go new places. I love new experiences. Depends on what the stimulating environment is, quite honestly. I'm a little iffy on that one, but I can see his point. Okay? So what's next with them? Slide 31 shows us that neuroticism and stability are the second set of traits that he said were fundamental. We label people neurotic sometimes. I do too. People that are neurotic usually are those people that the sky is always falling for. Something's always going to go wrong. Something bad is always going to happen. They always, what we consider, overreact emotionally. They aren't particularly stable emotionally. And they're just kind of a pain to deal with sometimes, to tell you the truth, because they always think everything's going to go wrong. And people that are stable are more emotionally even. And I think with this coronavirus, if you've been on Facebook or Twitter or any of those things, and I don't know how you avoid being there, you see that some people are just over the top in both directions. I know somebody that says, I'm not going to get the flu because I don't want to get the flu. Well, that's pretty arrogant in my way of thinking. But then I know people that they will hardly even pick up their mail because they're afraid they'll get the virus off of their postage that comes in. There's extremes on both sides of this. So neuroticism, neurotic on one side, stable on the other side. And the third one of his theories is psychoticism. And this came from later research that he did. This wasn't one of his original ideas. But what we're talking about here is psychopaths, sociopaths, to be real honest about it. He says that if you're high in psychoticism, you are that antisocial, cold, hostile person, unconcerned for other people. Well, now, there's even a range within these. Within this psychoticism and antisocial, people that have probably antisocial personality behavior disorder, quite honestly, make great presidents of big companies because they care about the money. They care about the stock price, and they don't really pay much attention at all to the folks working underneath them. It's all about the profit, and it's all about the money. And if you're going to invest in a company, you want it to be about the profit and the money. But how much do they care about the little person? Yeah, not really. Maybe they don't own a big company. Maybe they're just kind of the people that are users. They're very manipulative. You find yourself loaning them money when you don't want to. You find yourself doing things that you didn't really want to do because they suggested it and you went along with it. Remember, they're manipulators. They're con men. They're cold. They're unloving. But they can be really, really, really sly and sneaky and make you think that you're special until they get what they want. That's the antisocial end of that psychoticism. People that are low in psychoticism, these are the people I want to be. I want to be warm and caring for other people. I want to reach out and help my fellow man. I want to be good to animals. I don't want to be that person that only cares about myself and nothing else. And we look at this now, we use neuroscience to look at this. We look at brain activity in some ways to figure out these traits with people. But really, 3 sets of terms on a range basis is pretty limited. It doesn't seem to, one, give us any reasons why or explain anything, and secondly, it's just limiting as far as why people are the way they are. So here on slide 32, we have what we've seen so far. 16 personality factors, probably too many, and 3 are too few. And so they had to rework this all again, and they came up with what we call the Big Five, the Big Five model. Extraversion and introversion, neuroticism and stability, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to experience. This is very popular. This is probably the primary model that's used in today's world. Some believe that these may be universal and that these traits show to be really stable over time within people and consistent across different situations. But let's face it, traits and situations are complex. I'm a pretty mellow person. I like people. I don't like to be a jerk. I usually flexible, roll with whatever's going on, but not always. My husband and I call it a Cabela moment. It was when we were engaged and the wedding was coming up, and it was the end of the semester, so it was Christmas time, and I was buying Christmas gifts for my soon-to-be stepchildren, and I was, as well as my own kids, and I was planning a wedding, and I was trying to get finals done and graded, and all of this going on. And my husband we were supposed to go out to dinner, and he said, how about we go out to Legends and shop a little bit? And I didn't want to, but, trying to be agreeable, I said yes. So we went to Cabela's. He says there's a picture of me and they'll never let me in again. So anyway, there was a bit of a disagreement over a sales tag between me and a clerk, and then she called another clerk, and they were very dismissive of me and very dismissive of their own signage over this rack of clothing that was on sale that I wanted to buy something for. I came undone, folks. I came undone in a way that my husband's only seen me come undone once. I came undone screaming and cursing, threw the shirts down, and walked out of the store. And I walked out of the store sobbing because I thought, oh my God, now my husband's really seen who I can be, or my soon-to-be husband. He's going to break off the engagement. Well, gladly he didn't. In fact, he stopped on the way home and bought me flowers. And he did the now there, honey, which is nice. But I tell you this silly story, which is true, to show you that even though you have these changes of behavior from time to time due to a situation, you do have a track that you roll along that's pretty stable. Sometimes you can jump the track, and it doesn't mean that you're not like that. These 5 traits that they've come up with. Along with traits, they look at genetics. It's called behavioral genetics, and they try to find out how much is hereditary and how much is environment. Same old argument we've heard all along. And one of the methods they use for this are twin studies. And it used to be that identical twins, as well as fraternal twins, were frequently split up as infants when they were put into an orphanage of some kind, and they weren't raised together. So in later years, when they learned that they were adopted, some people have tried to find their birth sibling, and they make great subjects for this kind of research. Now, we've probably all seen, or you should see, the situation with the 2 guys, the 2 identical twins that they found. That's just hysterical. These guys not only look just alike, but they dress alike. They drink the same kind of beer. They smoke the same kind of smokes. They both crunch their beer cans when they finish drinking it. They drive the same kind of car, the same color of car. I mean, it's just like they're the same. And people say, wow, genetically, they're just the same. Well, it doesn't always turn out that identical twins are like that. But we do see that there are many times similarities between identical twins that were separated at birth that are just unexplainable other than it's hereditary. My grandmother used to say to me, "You are just like your father." And that was not a compliment. When I was about 13 and she said to me, "You're just like your father's side of the family," I responded with, "Well, thank God I'm not like the crazy side of the family." That wasn't very nice, was it? I love my grandma so much. I can't believe I had such a smart mouth on me. Anyway, she knew that side of the family. I really didn't know them. And in later years, as I got to know them, you know what? She's right. I am a lot like my dad and his side of the family. I just didn't know it at the time. And of course, I have spent a good deal of my life trying to not be like my mom. My grandparents were wonderful people. So behavioral genetics, part of it's hereditary, part of its environment. We figure it's about a 50-50 split, but we can inherit the possibility of these traits being obvious in our lives. You don't have to show a trait just because you've inherited it. Sometimes situations take over, environment takes over. Emergenic is this term that we use for the combining of multiple genes, because you're going to get, say you get introversion from your father and extraversion from your mother. How's that all going to work out for you genetically? So we try to look at those things as well. Psychology is not a stale, static science. It's always changing. So let's evaluate the trait perspective a little bit. I totally agree that people can be compared on traits. We can sit down and talk about these traits and probably decide between us how we're different and how we're alike. But there are some shortcomings with this. While we know how we are now, we don't particularly know how we got this way. Was it our environment? Was it our hereditary inheritance? Was it, if it was our environment, what was it? Children that are identical twins coming out of the same family can be extremely different. So there's not a lot of explanation going on with this. Why do some traits develop and some traits don't? We don't know. And trait theory certainly doesn't do anything to explain it. It just says this is the way it is. Motivations aren't explained. What are the drives? What's going on unconsciously? How do you believe about yourself? How do you intend to change and grow? Or do you think you're just static and stagnant, going to stay in the same place? The traits are fun to deal with. The traits are fun to even compare with our family or our significant other. Sometimes they are misused. Sometimes they are used in businesses for hiring. I hate it when they do that. These tests are not designed for that at all. Here on slide 35, we'll look at some different kinds of tests. Now, these trait tests are used for hiring, and they're not valid, they're not reliable. They don't necessarily give you the same results time after time. It just depends on how you're feeling the day you take it, and they may not really measure what they think they're measuring. But there are other kinds of tests that are out there that are fun to try to look at what's on the inside of your head. First one of these is a projective test. The Rorschack Inkblot Test. You know what that is. It looks like you took ink and folded over a piece of paper and smushed it so you get a mirror image. This is an old test, 1921. Rorschach was a Swiss guy who was trying to figure out what was going on with people. It really doesn't give us any evidence. It gives us an idea of what's going on in your head. Let's say I show one person a Rorschach Inkblot over here, and they say, "Oh, that looks like a vase of flowers." I show them another one, and they say, "Oh, I think that's a mirror image of a deer with antlers." I show them another one, and they say, "Oh, that looks like a waterfall." Okay, well, maybe I can tell that they like flowers on the outside, and maybe in looking back at the research on the Rorschach test, those are fairly common answers for those. And then I show the same 3 Rorschach blots to somebody else, and they go, "Oh, gosh, dirty pictures. That's 2 deer doing it in the woods." I show them another one, and they go, "Oh, more dirty pictures I see. That's 2 people doing it in the woods. Gosh." I show them the third one, and they say, "Boy, that's 2 ducks doing it in the woods." Okay, we can tell a couple of things by that. One, they really like the woods. 2, they're sort of preoccupied with sex, aren't they? So we kind of get an idea of what we're dealing with. There are standards for this test. We know when people fall into different areas, and we have an idea of what's going on. But they're more about getting the client relaxed and just kind of getting a little bit of color background before we start the game, so to speak. The Thematic Apperception Test, the TAT, can give us a lot of information, but it's got some fallbacks too. Let me explain to you how it works. With the TAT, you're going to be shown line drawings. And then you're going to tell the person who's showing you the line drawings, who's going to analyze this information, what you think the story is behind the line drawings. So perhaps I show you a drawing and it's a woman sitting at a desk and the man standing beside her, handing her some papers or holding some papers. You say, oh gosh, well that's the female president of the company and her male administrative assistant is bringing her some contracts. Okay, good story. And I show it to someone else and they say, oh, that's the boss coming in from his office to give his secretary some work to do. Well, that's the other side of the coin, isn't it? And I show it to the third person and they say, oh, that's that lech in accounting and he's looking down her blouse. Well, I might suppose that this person's having a little bit of trouble or has had trouble at work with sexual harassment. So see, it's not evidence, it's not an experiment, but it gives me an idea of what is going on. These are interesting. It helps a therapist see where the person is at the time, but it doesn't predict any behavior that you're going to see from them based on my judgment. Am I having a good day or a bad day when I make these subjective scorings on these tests? Would it be consistent if I gave them these drawings 2 weeks from now? Would they give me the same kind of answers? And even my behavior, the mood I'm in, feedback I give them just through body language or a smile might change their response on similar kinds of things. So they're interesting, they may be helpful, but they are not evidence. There's no proof there. And then there are self-report inventories. The first one of these is the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. Oh gosh, this thing is just murderous to take. It has 561 questions, and you can only answer yes or no. You can't say maybe. You can't say sometimes. It is yes or no. It was designed originally to show psychological disorders. It wasn't set up to diagnose normal. It was set up to diagnose disorders, and it was used in prisons. Last time I knew, they still use this in some situations to see how well balanced someone was before they let them out of prison. Gee, are you going to get to go out early, or are you going to get to stay in here? So these yes/no statements, and some of them are just weird. I urinate more frequently than other people. Okay, that's weird, but maybe I have an idea, yes or no. Let's see, how about sometimes I wished I could kill my parents? Well, if you say yes, well, we've all been teenagers, and we know there were times that we just almost would have liked to have. If you say yes, they're not going to let you out. But if you say no, they're going to think you're lying. There's lots of things that seem like trick questions in that. They're really looking, when they run this through the computer, these 561 questions, again, there's a factor analysis involved with it, and there are scales for reading the results. I've taken it, and I'll tell you what, at first, you're trying to remember how you answered a question sort of like this before, but by the time you finish, you've been asked the same question several times in slightly different ways, and you really can't seem to remember how you answered it in the first place. So it's really, really, really frustrating. Then there's the CPI. It's set up for normal populations. It's set up to help, look at depression and paranoia and hypochondriasis and those kinds of things. There are, I think, 10 clinical scales that they set into that. And again, it's a paper pencil test that you take. But it's meant for the normal population, not for the abnormal population. And then there's the 16PF. We still use that, and the Myers-Briggs type indicators. Myers-Briggs is the most frequently given personality profile around the world. It's been around since, I think the 1940s. I think it was a mother-daughter pair or something that came up with it. I don't quite remember, and to tell you the truth. California Personality Inventory is sometimes used with legal matters and custody and that kind of thing. Myers-Briggs is sometimes used for work purposes, for hiring, for counseling purposes, this kind of thing. Validity and reliability are both very, very, very questionable, but you saw when you took this and looked at the answers that there's introversion and extraversion, there's sensing, and then there's being intuitive, there's thinking versus feeling, and there's judgment or perception. In other words, judgment or perception, that's do you look at the evidence or you just think something? I think I'm an ENTJ or something. I'd have to pull my scores out. I don't remember anymore. When I was in business, I had to take this all the time. It was real popular at the time in the field I was in. And I knew how to show up as an extrovert because I knew that's what they wanted in the field that I was working in, sales management and marketing. They didn't want introverts. They wanted extroverts. So I knew how to fool the test without getting caught because there are lie detectors built into it. So once I was out of the business world and kind of got out of that way of thinking and took a Myers-Briggs, it was different than the ones I had taken, even the ones I had taken honestly when I was in the business world. It was sort of an interesting thing to see for me, but I hope you enjoyed them. From what I've read so far, you did, and I've really enjoyed reading your responses. It looks like it was a fun thing. Some of you even did it with more than one person or got your other family members. Well, this last slide talks about possible selves. Who do we want to be and how do we want to get there? Possible self is a view of what you are capable of as you go through your life, the expectations that you have for your life. Hazel Marcus and her colleagues said that this concept of ourselves made a big difference in how we turned out. This sounds like Carl Rogers again, doesn't it? Maybe you have in your mind that you want to be like somebody you know. And I'm sure that I wanted to be like my grandmother in many ways. She was loving and kind and thoughtful and loved animals. And my granddad was helpful and fair and a wonderful businessman and a wonderful farmer, and they were just incredible people. So when I looked at who I wanted to be, I wanted to be like them. I wanted to be nurturing and understanding and warm and loving and there for the people that I cared about. And quite honestly, when I looked at my parents, they were kind of harsh and judgmental and emotionally cold and kind of neglectful, to tell you the truth. So I spent much of my life, my possible self that I was looking for, wanting to not be and trying to not be like many of the traits I saw in both of my parents. And and they had good traits too. My mother loved animals. I've already shared with you that she had a radio show about animals. She was an artist. She was a musician. She had some wonderful qualities about her. And I grew up loving animals. Maybe not the 30s she had when she passed away, but I love animals and take care of animals. And I'm artistic in ways that are both similar and different from what she was. My dad was really analytical. He was a bit of an engineer. He could analyze anything. He didn't have much emotion about things, but he was very, very practical and pragmatic, and I liked that about him, that he didn't get carried away and yell and holler. He analyzed the situation and solved the problem, and I am a lot like that. So these possible selves, what I saw for myself, have motivated me in my life. They have controlled the decisions that I made. They probably will continue with future behaviors that I have. I have 2 little grandkids. I'm going to interact with these little grandkids. I'm going to try to be as much like my grandparents with them as I can possibly be, because that's what I see as my possible self as a nanny. So when you look at these factors, think about who you are and where you are and who you want to be and where you want to go. And when these things don't overlap in that Venn diagram where you are or you're working toward who you want to be and you're working toward where you want to be, adjust it. You guys are young now. You can do a lot of adjusting. You don't have to be who someone else thinks you are. You don't have to meet someone else's expectations. Your value as a person does not depend on you meeting someone else's expectations. This is the hardest thing that I have ever tried to get young people to see in a therapeutic situation, that they are not who they think people have said that they are when it's negative. If you were in the middle of the ocean without fancy shoes or clothes or a hat or your phone, you would be just as absolutely valuable as you are at any other time in your life, because it's all inside of you. All right, so much for this chapter.